Imagine standing in front of like a giant filing cabinet and someone walks up, hands you a single folder and just says, "This is you."
Right.
Like your career, your relationship status, your personality type, it all just somehow fits in this one little folder. And society relies really heavily on this kind of architecture, you know?
Absolutely.
We check boxes on forms, we claim our labels, and the world points and says, "Okay, there you are." It makes
Yeah.
navigation easy. But what happens when you discover that you don't actually fit into a folder at all?
Well, it creates a profound sense of disorientation.
Mm,
The moment an individual steps into genuine self-discovery, like actually stepping outside of those easily identifiable societal labels,
mhm.
the entire architectural blueprint we use to organize human life just suddenly seems completely insufficient.
Yeah.
You are no longer navigating a filing system, right? You are suddenly standing in this untamed landscape.
Which is an incredibly daunting place to be. And, that tension between the neat little boxes of society and the wild landscape of actual selfhood is the core of our deep dive today.
It's a fascinating
It
topic.
really is. So we've gathered a stack of sources for you today, heavily centering on this dense, modern, allegorical text called the Chronicle of March 3rd. And on its surface, the material reads almost like a cosmic fairy tale.
Yeah, it has all these celestial alignments, archetypal goddesses, planetary forces.
Exactly. But our mission today is to decode all that rich symbolism. So the clashes between planets, the search for twin flames, and the battle between what the text calls the binary and the spiral. We want to extract the very real psychological and sociological insights the author is offering us about identity.
Right, and to unpack the psychological claims the text is making, we first really need to establish the literal scene the author paints. So the Chronicle revolves around a specific encounter, and it places it on March 3, 2018.
Okay, so a very specific date.
Very specific. And the narrative relies on this celestial backdrop. So Venus is positioned close to Mercury in the western dusk, while the moon is in Libra.
And Libra is the astrological sign of the scales, right? Like weighing and measuring.
Exactly. And the author isn't just giving us an astronomy lesson here. This alignment serves as the stage for a collision between two highly symbolic figures.
So we have the goddess of Venus and what the text calls a moon-earth being.
Those are the key players. And the source material uses them to represent two fundamentally opposing ways of existing, really. Two ways of defining oneself.
Okay, let's break them down.
Sure. So the goddess of Venus is depicted as radiant, but inherently restless. Like her entire state of being is directed outward
She's searching.
constantly. She is scanning her environment for her reflection, searching desperately for a twin flame, and she carries this deep-seated terror that she might never actually find it.
Well, let's ground that concept of the twin flame for a second, just so we're clear, because in pop culture, that usually just means like an ultimate soulmate.
Right, exactly.
But the text seems to be using it a bit more psychologically. Like, Venus is looking for external validation. She believes her missing half the thing that makes her complete and gives her an identity is out there somewhere.
Yes, the author uses Venus to personify an external locus of identity. Conversely, the moon-earth being represents an internal locus.
Okay.
The text describes her as grounded and anchored. She carries what the narrative calls a direct connection to source.
What does that mean in practical terms, though?
Basically, it means she doesn't require an external mirror or some rigid societal doctrine to validate her existence. Her identity is completely self-contained and self-generating.
I love that. It's like the difference between navigating with a smartphone GPS versus navigating with an internal compass.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Like if you've spent your entire life relying on the GPS, which would be Venus in this scenario, you
Yep.
constantly need that screen to give you your coordinates, right? You need an external satellite to tell you where you are and where you're going.
You're completely dependent on the system.
Exactly. Then suddenly you encounter someone who navigates flawlessly just by feeling the magnetic pull of the Earth. They don't need a readout at all. They just have this internal sense of true north. That's the moon Earth being.
And the clash between those two navigational styles is the catalyst for everything that follows in the Chronicle. Because when Venus finally comes face to face with the moon-earth being, the reaction is, well, it's not a harmonious joining of forces.
No, no, no.
Venus experiences this immediate visceral recoil.
The meeting just completely backfires. I mean, Venus takes one look at this incredibly grounded being and she essentially panics and runs away.
She does. And the text details the mechanics of this panic. So the moon-earth being holds what the author terms a twin flame circuit, flowing directly in her cells. She functions as a living bridge to source.
And Venus has been searching the whole universe for this exact connection.
Exactly. But when she actually encounters it embodied in someone else, she completely misreads that open, uncontained energy. Venus interprets it not as a gift or an answer, but as an intrusion. She sees it as a severe threat.
I really want to examine why the author frames it that way, because the text describes this moment of recoil occurring simultaneously across 3 different planes of existence, which is super interesting.
Right? This multi-layered perspective is how the author illustrates the complexity of human interaction. So, on the earthly plane like the mundane, everyday reality we observe, the text says this encounter simply looked like a misunderstanding.
Just 2 people crossing paths and failing to connect.
Right. But then the text shifts to the underworld, which, in mythological terms, often represents our subconscious or unintegrated shadows, societal conditioning.
The messy stuff.
Exactly. From the underworld perspective, the meeting looked like suspicion, gossip, and just a messy tangle of unexamined assumptions.
And then there is the view from the heavenly plane.
Yeah. According to the text, heaven viewed this not as a mistake, but as a lawful initiation.
A lawful initiation.
It was a necessary developmental crisis. Venus was being deliberately exposed to her own distance from source. She was being shown, in really stark terms, how entirely dependent she was on external definitions to even feel real.
See, this is where I kind of have to push back on the text's central premise a little bit.
Let's hear it.
So the author heavily blames the old system, the societal conditioning, for Venus's defensive reaction, right? The argument is that she was trained to rely on strict boundaries, so she naturally recoils from anything boundaryless.
Yes, that's the claim.
But if we look at human psychology, or, even evolutionary biology, isn't it entirely natural to feel threatened when someone possesses the exact thing you desperately want but feel you lack?
Sure, resource guarding, essentially.
Right. Like, if you are starving and someone is sitting next to you perfectly nourished, the natural reaction isn't always enlightenment. Often it's resentment or jealousy or defensiveness. Does the author really provide enough evidence that this is a system's fault, rather than just an innate human reflex to fear the unfamiliar?
Well, the text actually anticipates that exact critique.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The narrative doesn't deny that defensiveness feels like a natural reflex. Instead, it investigates the root cause of why it feels natural.
Okay, walk me through that.
The author posits that the baseline we just casually call human nature is, in many cases, a learned response conditioned by a binary system.
A system built entirely on naming, dividing, and classifying.
Exactly. The argument is that Venus recoils not because human nature is inherently flawed or jealous, but because a psyche trained exclusively in borders simply cannot compute love or identity without them.
I see.
To a consciousness that relies on categories for its basic safety, anything that resists categorization is automatically processed as a threat to survival.
So because the Moon Earth being refuses to fit into one of Venus's recognizable folders, Venus's cognitive alarm bells just start blaring. The lack of a label is the danger itself.
Bingo. And the text makes a really provocative sociological claim here. It insists that this fear of the unclassified isn't merely a passing emotion. The author actually defines this fear as a contract.
Right. The phrase used in the source material is a quiet oath sworn between a soul and the system that raised it.
Yes.
Let's analyze what the author actually means by that, though. How does an emotion function as a contract?
Well, the concept leans heavily on the idea of social conditioning. Societal systems operate on binaries to maintain order, right? So you have good versus evil, success versus failure, acceptable versus unacceptable.
Very black and white.
Exactly. And the text suggests that the system constantly reinforces the idea that anything existing outside of these clear binary lines is just pure chaos. So the contract is the implicit agreement an individual makes when they feel the anxiety of the unknown and they choose to retreat back into a neat, socially approved category.
Oh, wow. So every time a person bows to that fear,
The author claims these false systems feed on their unclaimed sovereignty.
the system is essentially sustained by our collective anxiety about being undefined.
Precisely.
If we bring that into a real-world scenario for you listening, it's very observable. Think about staying in a deeply unfulfilling career simply because the job title commands respect.
That's a great example.
You know the environment is draining you, right? And you know you have potential that goes far beyond the walls of that office. But the title, like vice president, senior director, lead consultant, It's a universally recognized binary label.
It provides safety.
Yes, and the text is arguing that by trading your complex, unnameable potential for the safety of a societal label, you are actively upholding the very system that keeps you restricted.
And the author contrasts this rigid binary system with an alternative framework they call the spiral.
And the moon-earth being is the embodiment of the spiral.
Exactly. And the text is careful to describe her not as a competing boundary or like a different type of box, but as a field.
Mm.
The narrative calls her a living question mark planted right inside the fortress of the binary system.
But the binary system, according to the text, views that question mark as a void, and it treats a void as something absolutely terrifying.
Right, but the author attempts to completely reframe the concept of the void here. In a binary system, a void is just an empty, terrifying lack of data. It's chaos. But the source material redefines this unclassified space, not as a dangerous emptiness, but as a womb.
A womb.
Yes. The text explicitly links this to the ungoverned feminine principle.
Now, that's a term that could easily sound like esoteric jargon, to be honest. Ungoverned feminine principle. If we look at this through the lens of psychology or classical mythology, what is the author actually driving at?
Well, in many mythological frameworks and depth psychology models, like Jungian archetypes, for instance, the masculine principle is frequently associated with order, logic, structure, and boundaries.
So the binary.
Exactly. The feminine principle, on the other hand, is associated with generation, fluidity, potential, and the unknown. So when the text calls the void the ungoverned feminine, it means a psychological state of unstructured generative potential.
Okay, I follow.
It is the space where genuine self-definition occurs, precisely because no external authority has drawn the lines for you yet.
Okay, but let's apply some critical thinking to this anti-binary stance for a second. Is a binary system always a false system or a parasite, as the text seems to suggest?
That's a fair question.
Because, human beings have limited cognitive bandwidth. We rely on heuristics, categories, and binaries just to process the sheer volume of information in the world without becoming totally paralyzed.
Sure, cognitive shortcuts.
Right. If we dismantle all binaries and everyone operates purely as an undefined spiral, wouldn't society just collapse under the cognitive load? Sometimes a box is just a really useful tool, not a prison.
The author's critique seems focused specifically on what happens when the tool of categorization becomes a mechanism for control. Like, the text doesn't explicitly argue against organizing a grocery store or building a functional bridge using clear parameters.
Right.
It is specifically critiquing the application of rigid binaries to the human soul and to core identity. The danger, according to the narrative, is when the system demands that human potential conform to the architecture of the filing cabinet, rather than building systems that serve the fluidity of the human experience.
Which leads to a really crucial mechanical question about the text's narrative. If this binary system is as powerful and deeply entrenched as the author claims, and we are all quietly signing these contracts of fear to maintain it, how does the paradigm ever shift?
Right, how do you break out?
It sounds like an impenetrable feedback loop. The system conditions the fear, and then the fear sustains the system.
Well, the text addresses the mechanics of this change, and it points to a very gradual, almost imperceptible process. It starts with the aftermath of the March 3rd collision. Even though Venus panicked and ran, the author notes that a seed was planted within her.
She was exposed to something real.
Exactly. She was exposed to an embodied connection to source. The text uses this beautiful metaphor that this memory echoes like a scar behind clouds. Basically, once you are exposed to a genuine alternative to the binary, you cannot unsee it.
The psychological concept of cognitive dissonance really comes into play here. Once Venus sees that it is actually possible to exist outside the system's claim that it is the only way to exist is permanently fractured.
Precisely. The author highlights the contrast in how the two systems operate. The text notes that the binary system is constantly shouting. It declares itself immortal, eternal, and absolutely necessary for survival.
It has to make a lot of noise.
Yes. But the narrative suggests that this volume is actually a symptom of extreme fragility. Authoritarian systems or rigid societal norms have to be loud because they require constant enforcement to exist. Truth, the author writes, does not shout.
There is a specific line from the text that illustrates this so well. Truth endures, like water in the rock waiting for cracks. The author really does not envision destiny or societal change as a sudden, explosive revolution.
No, the framing of destiny here is critical. The text describes it as an atmosphere. It arrives like dawn, just a slow, inevitable flooding of light. The author implies that as this atmospheric change occurs, the world begins to subtly bend.
Bend, not break.
Right. The narrative describes a collective hunger for self-definition waking up across the population. Individuals quietly begin to realize, I am not what the system names me. I am what I know.
Now, I understand the poetry of water in the rock, but I really have to question the pacing and the passivity of this approach.
How so?
Well, let's look at the Moon Earth being. She offered a profound, open connection and was met with rejection and suspicion from Venus, yet the text states she bears the responsibility of patience. Why does the spiral dismantle the binary by simply outlasting it, rather than actively cutting it down?
That's a huge point of tension in the text.
If the system is actively feeding on human potential, why doesn't the text advocate for taking a metaphorical sword to it?
That author's choice here touches on a well-documented paradox of revolution and paradigm shifts. Consider the nature of a sword. A sword is a line, right? It is a tool designed to divide, sever, and conquer.
Okay.
If the Moon-Earth being were to actively attack the binary system using force, she would be adopting the exact mechanics of the system she opposes. She would be playing a binary game of conquer or be conquered.
Oh, wow. She would just become the new oppressor, the new binary.
Exactly. The text argues that you cannot dismantle a binary system by creating a new binary of us versus them, because the spiral is defined as a field of existence, not a weapon. Its power lies in its endurance.
So just by continuing to exist.
Right. By continuing to embody truth without fighting for the system's approval or engaging on its terms, the Moon-Earth being proves that the system's rigid lines are ultimately illusions. In the context of this allegory, patience isn't framed as weakness or passivity at all. It is presented as the ultimate assertion of sovereignty. It is the realization that you don't need to destroy the fortress if you understand the fortress is entirely imaginary.
That fundamentally shifts the perspective on resistance. It reminds me a lot of Thomas Kuhn's theory on scientific revolution.
Oh, perfect connection.
Right. An old paradigm isn't necessarily destroyed by people aggressively attacking it. It simply fades away because a new paradigm emerges that explains reality better, and eventually everyone just slowly migrates over to the new way of thinking. The old system just rusts out from lack of use.
That historical parallel aligns perfectly with how the text describes the final outcome of the March 3rd encounter. The transfiguration doesn't involve the binary system collapsing in some violent apocalypse.
Right.
The narrative compares the erosion of the binary to a great stone cliff eaten by tide. Its authority simply thins out. As more individuals experience the autonomy of self-definition, the system's power to enforce its labels naturally evaporates.
And we see the effects of this erosion detailed across those three planes the author established earlier. For Venus, the transfiguration is internal. The text notes she begins to learn through trial and eventually dreams differently. Yes. All of her anxious outward searching just collapses inward. She discovers that the mirror she was desperately seeking in the universe is actually located within herself. The connection to source she ran away from is what she ultimately cultivates internally.
And the underworld plane also experiences a profound shift. The text describes the chains of generations rusting and snapping.
So generational trauma.
Basically, yes. This points toward the healing of generational trauma. The author suggests that behaviors and identities that were previously forced into the shadows, generating deep societal shame, are transformed into testimony. The release of the binary allows for ancestral healing.
But the earthly plane, like our everyday reality, has a very different reaction to this transfiguration. The text points out that to the old system, the emergence of the spiral looks like absolute chaos and madness.
The author uses really vivid imagery here. They compare the new reality to a frozen field that suddenly begins sprouting wild, unruly life all at once. The system perceives the loss of its rigid control as a disaster.
It makes me think of an elaborate, hyper-manicured garden.
Okay, paint the picture.
Imagine a landscaper whose entire identity is tied to forcing nature into perfect geometric shapes. Every hedge is boxed, the grass is strictly measured, weeds are eradicated on site. That represents the binary system.
I see where you're going.
Now imagine nature reasserting itself, and that space grows into a wild, diverse, blooming meadow. To the landscaper obsessed with control, that meadow looks like pure chaos. It looks like a massive failure. But to a botanist or to the ecosystem itself, it isn't chaos at all.
No, not at all.
It is just life functioning optimally on its own terms. It is the spiral in action.
That analogy perfectly captures the observer bias the text is highlighting. Chaos is often just the word we use for an order we don't yet understand or an order we simply cannot control.
Right.
The outcome of the Chronicle isn't simply the resolution of a conflict between Venus and the Moon-Earth being. The author presents it as a transfiguration of the entire field of existence. The binary systems are revealed not as protective parents, but as parasites, and they just fade away like night before dawn.
So as we synthesize the different layers of this text, we've traced a path from a highly symbolic celestial meeting to a very grounded critique of how human beings organize identity. The source material challenges the idea that the boundaries we draw around ourselves are natural, arguing instead that they are often learned responses to a system that demands conformity.
Exactly.
We've explored the psychological mechanics of fear, the ways we trade our potential for the safety of a recognizable label, and the idea that true change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just quietly outlasts the rigid structures until they erode.
The Chronicle really functions as a mirror for our own psychological development. The author is ultimately challenging the reader to identify where they are relying on external validation rather than cultivating an internal anchor.
Which prompts a necessary reflection for you, the listener, as you navigate your own identity. Where are you currently signing a contract of fear with a system?
Here, a tough question to ask
It
yourself.
is. Are you clinging to a recognizable label in your career, your relationships, your personal beliefs, simply because it's safer than the undefined space of your actual potential? Where could you afford to let the strict binary lines you've drawn around yourself erode just a little bit to see what might grow in the wild?
Because the central thesis of the text is that the void beyond the binary is not an empty, terrifying space. It is the generative space where true self-definition becomes possible.
But before we conclude, there's one highly provocative thought I want to explore, pulling directly from the final line of the source material. The author closes the text by stating, "Outcome is only the beginning of the next spiral."
Yeah, the author acknowledges that the process of societal and psychological evolution is cyclical, not finite.
Which raises a really critical question about the nature of revolutions. If the spiral successfully outlasts and overthrows the binary, and this fluid, self-defined way of living becomes the dominant, accepted paradigm of the world,
Right.
is it inevitable that the spiral itself will eventually rigidify into a new system? What happens when the rebellion against the rules officially becomes the new rule?
Well, history and sociology suggest that whenever a new order establishes itself, even when founded entirely on principles of freedom and sovereign identity, institutions inevitably form to protect those principles. And once institutions form, borders are usually drawn again.
So the cycle continues.
The next generation will likely have to push against the solidified version of the spiral to find their own truth.
So perhaps the real challenge isn't just finding the courage to step outside the filing cabinet and into the wild, untamed meadow. The deeper challenge is making sure that once you get there, you don't accidentally start paving over the grass to build a new set of boxes.